Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast.
Welcome again to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast, everyone. Good to see you both, Christina and Michael.
You too.
I
Good
have
to
to
see you.
say, that I really enjoyed discussing these chapters with you both, and I really enjoyed your inputs and your insights, and also the information that you brought from your own backgrounds and practices. And I have to say, it's actually it's bittersweet coming to an end with our discussion on this great book, Bad Therapy: Why Our Kids Aren't Growing Up. What would you say? What has your experience been like?
Well, I
Yeah,
think it's
Christine, please.
been, yeah, I think it's been a wonderful experience as well. I certainly learned a lot from the two of you. And it was interesting to have an outsider's perspective. Although she's not a therapist, she's quite savvy on the therapy
Yeah.
world. So to have that kind of insight, I thought was good. Interestingly, I think where I started to become a little bit more okay, I think maybe you're missing a couple of key points is actually this last couple of chapters that we're going to talk about today, specifically when
Okay.
talking about um, children and independence and giving them their independence and space to mature and to develop and not kind of be helicopter parents, that kind of thing. She makes some excellent points, but then there were also some things that I thought, well, I'm not too sure I fully wholeheartedly agree with that. So I think it'll be an
Hmm.
interesting conversation today because it sort of comes now full circle from where we started at the beginning. Um, so I think it's been good, Michael.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed getting to see, like we said at the beginning, like you just said, Christine, that outsider's perspective. And then also recognizing, particularly at the end here, what a monumental task she set out for herself. Abigail Shrier, what a tall mountain she set up to try and traverse as we're talking about so many different topics that could easily be their own tomes, their own sub-disciplines. Some of them are disciplines in and of themselves and trying to look at in a kind of a contemporary sense the overlap between these different dynamics and factors in kids' lives that are overflowing into their worlds and having an effect on maybe some of them, maybe all of them, maybe a few of them. It's hard to tell throughout the entire book because, as we said in previous episodes, it kind of depends what we're talking about and what things we're taking into consideration with some of her critiques. I guess one of the interesting parts of going over a critique is that sometimes it's in very broad strokes. And then there were moments that I felt were very specific and very poignant, and I could see them in the cultural moment. And then there were some where I was like, maybe. It depends what we're talking about, when we're talking about, where we're talking about these things.
Hmm.
And again, it's a monumental task to try and critique a time period almost, a cultural moment, without missing a few things. But I think there was a lot that she captured that's very relevant and very much worth discussing.
Yeah.
Look, I would really like to hear some of the areas of maybe some disagreement or hesitation
Mm.
on your parts, seeing that both of you mentioned some hesitation, some of the conclusions that she draws.
Mhm.
But maybe we can start. So the second last chapter, chapter 11, this will be our last session. Um, what what did you guys find interesting from this chapter? Just from my perspective, what I really
Mhm.
enjoyed was how she captured this tendency, especially this new trend among parents. There's almost this competition to try and be the best parents ever. And trying to be the best parents ever is trying to gratify your child to their
Yes.
absolute maximum. And then you run into trouble because your child has been de-skilled, your child doesn't have as much resilience, and because of that, the child doesn't adequately emotionally develop as they would have. And then they take the child to a therapist, and then the child gets a diagnosis and medication, and the rest is history. And the child don't really recover from that whole experience. And this extreme protectionism when the child is eager to explore, those early phases of development, when the child is eager to explore, when the world is their oyster, they're being stifled. And then adolescence comes and young adulthood comes. And then they're no longer interested in exploration. And that is exactly when they need to then proceed and continue this instinct of exploration and generalize the skills, the abilities, the lessons, within themselves, their own physical abilities, but also relational lessons that they have gained during these earlier phases of development. That is when they need to generalize those lessons into the wider
Yes.
world and grow up to become well-adjusted adults.
Yeah.
And the word she
I
uses is,
yeah.
sorry, Chrissy, the word she uses is subtraction.
Yes.
She tells the parents, get
Subtract
out of their
yourself.
way.
Yes.
They won't die. Children don't die that easily.
Yes. I mean, I think that there's definitely a lot of positive, commentary that she has about this. But what got me thinking a little bit is maybe my own personal history. Growing up as a child that was a latchkey kid, right? That's what we say when we say both our parents work. And most of the time, the parents don't come home until after you've been home from school for several hours and you barely maybe have a chance to see each other, homework time and bedtime. There's some piece or component there where she talks about sort of this independence and giving children, even as young as 9, 10, the freedom to say, walk home from school by yourself, for example, or to, take the bus across town in my situation by yourself. What I have to say is that I think that it's a case by case basis, and she does use a lot of very broad strokes to describe some of these phenomenon. Because I think there are times when the lack of the parent being involved enough is what is causing some of the kids' distress, rebellion, discomfort. And that I think has to do with somewhat how our society and world is set up. We live in a world now where unfortunately, both parents have to work in many families. Most families are structured that way in the United States, at least, right? So you're dealing with those added stresses and pressures. I don't know that parents are always in a position to connect with their kids on a daily basis or even a weekly basis sometimes because of the stressors that are placed on them. And I think sometimes that creates some tension or some stress, I guess some tension on the bond, on the attachment between the child and the parent, because it begins to look as if, am I more important, or is mom's job more important, or is dad's job more important? So I think in some ways that part of it's sort of neglected in this particular section. It's broadly discussed where we have to give them more freedom. And I 100% agree with that, because the helicopter parenting isn't working. But there needs to be a balance between that and staying on top of the fact that your kid might have had this awesome day at school and really wants to tell you about it, but you come home and you're too busy. And because there is so much independence established in the home, that there's not enough time for quality bonding or connection, and to be able to really sit down and have that kind of conversation with your kid and to stay plugged in. So I think that's where I agree with her. And I think there's a component that makes it more complex and not quite as simple as just subtracting yourself. That makes sense.
Gotcha.
And it makes me wonder, right, this was kind of coming up for me as I was reading. Do you guys think that we've gotten to this place where we've began to romanticize either dysfunction or resilience? That I think in Shrier's voice, what I hear is kind of a romanticization of the resilient child as being the default. And that very well may be the case. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's case dependent, as you said, Christine. But it's interesting as she's writing about the manuals, the parenting books, all of the best practices that you can kind of come up with their prescriptive ways of raising children. She's coming up with a couple of prescriptions of her own here with the idea of subtracting and pulling back, where for some parents who maybe are over encroaching on their kids, there may be some room that they need to start managing their anxieties a little bit better and not see their child as an extension or a manifestation of their anxieties in action, and maybe pull back a little bit, depending on where their kid is developmentally. And then there are those
Yeah.
parents who, for whatever reason, it could be circumstantial, and those have their own variables that are to consider, such as work or finances, that keep the parent less engaged. Let's just say maybe they'd like to be more engaged, but maybe they can't. But for those parents who maybe are more reserved and pulled back, is there a too far back in terms of being a parent?
Right.
So speaking to that happy middle that you're describing, I feel this almost this black and white romanticization of this kind of parent versus that kind of parent. And I think I was struggling with that.
Mm.
I do think, though, because of the ubiquity of this over-involved parenthood, and because this style of parenting that's everywhere and connected everywhere with WhatsApp groups and videos and TikTok videos and books and an industry, a multi-million-dollar industry of parenting, and even fields of parenting called gentle parenting, this kind of parenting, that kind of
Sure.
parenting. I just think she had to come out with all guns blazing and try and cover as much as possible and try and make a case. She studied law. Try and make a case as strongly as possible to clearly highlight and hopefully even convince as many people as possible to rethink, to critically think about their style of parenting. So I think, well, look, in principle, I agree. I agree with both of you. You know, that moderation. I'm just not too sure, whether someone who's so deeply invested in this emotionally over-involvement as a parent would pull back without a strong enough argument as the one she's building
So
in
then
her
this,
book.
I think, it speaks to a very specific audience then, this book. It may not be
Yeah.
applicable on a broad level.
Yes.
I think there's
No,
a
you're right.
target group of parents and parenting styles that she's getting at.
Mhm.
And I think go ahead. No, go ahead.
I couldn't help but as I write, I keep notes and I just kind of, find my brain kind of shuffling through what I want to call some specific thing that she's gathering. And I don't know if this is the right way to put it. I highly doubt that it is. But there was a point when she was describing all of this where I wrote, is this an affluent agenda? Is there a kind of a specific way that she's framing how parent-child relationships should look? Is she speaking to speaking to parents with a particular educational background, a particular cultural background? Who exactly are we talking to exactly in this book? I struggled with that throughout pretty much the last half of the book, both in terms of trying to discern what ages we were talking about, trying to discern where the kids were located. And again, Jaco, to your point, I certainly can see that she's trying to make a case here. She's trying to shake the snow globe up and get some attention here to something that really may need to be addressed. And I think she's made a really good case for some things that really need to be looked at. At the same time, oh, please.
No, go for it.
Well, at the same time, it's that monumental task of trying to capture, just taking the United States, trying to capture 50 states, trying to capture the variability amongst 50 states, every city in those states, every county, just trying to break it down to the most minuscule levels. It's hard. It's an impossible task. And so to your point, I can totally see that she does have to make a pretty booming stance here to be able to get those people who maybe are kind of asleep to some of their, what they believe to be the best laid plans of parenting, what kind of negative effects they might be having on their kids, even inadvertently. Yeah.
Look, to a huge swath of South African parents, for instance, this book wouldn't be applicable.
Interesting. Say more about that.
Right?
I'm curious.
No, but I mean, no, look, culturally, among certain cultures,
yes,
and also socioeconomically,
yes,
families would be struggling and children would have no choice than to survive. It just is what it is. So this book wouldn't be applicable to the vast majority of South African families, for instance. Right.
That's very fascinating. And I would say that that's, yes.
In fact, the opposite would be encouraged among those families, namely to show up.
Show up
And
more.
I would to show up more. Because and maybe I would go as far as saying maybe not so far as targeting mothers, but targeting fathers, because there's a huge lack in South Africa of incidents of fatherless households, and
Yeah.
fathers just disappearing and not abdicating their responsibilities as fathers. See, so a different book would be written for a different demographic. But like you said, I think it is more targeted at American families of a certain demographic.
That's exactly right. And I think that
Yeah.
demographic, I think you might have said it was on the more affluent side,
Yeah.
Michael. I think that's what you said. It
And
tends to
remember,
lean that way because the less affluent have a different set of problems or different set of responsibilities, or like they may be working two jobs. They may be, not really able. I mean, some families are struggling to put food on the table. I mean, if we're going to be really honest about that. So I do think that in some ways, yes, it is definitely appealing to a certain socioeconomic class, not race or anything, but class status,
no.
affluence, financially,
Yeah.
where you
Yeah.
are, and whether or not you have two working parents in the home. I can say from just anecdotal experience that homes where one of the parents was a stay-at-home, and typically was a stay-at-home mom, and the father or whomever went out to work, I would see more of this type of behavior among those parents than I would where the parents themselves had so much going on and were quite busy that they really didn't have that extra. In fact, sometimes so busy that they weren't paying attention to what was going on Instagram and social media, so much so that they had no idea that their child was using drugs, let's say, or in a really bad mess. So the opposite extreme I've seen, I think in homes where perhaps, like I said, people are working, maybe not white collar jobs. They might be working blue collar jobs, which may have hours that extend way into the evening. And they're not around when their kids get home from school. They're not around when, the kid has soccer practice on Saturday mornings. The kid catches a ride with their buddy there who plays with them, and that kind of dynamic. And then the single parenting, as you said, in South Africa, we have plenty of that here too in the US. So I think that was really good to point out and really clarify that it's really a specific targeted population. And she had to come in guns blazing with that population to get them to really understand and to wake up and to see what it is she's talking about with this overparenting business.
And also to warn the rest not to use this as an ideal standard. Don't use this style of parenting as the ideal we want we want to strive towards. This isn't helping. Improve to an extent. I mean, show up as you should, provide as you should, ensure that there is adequate emotional connection and nurturance in the family as the child needs it. But to this extreme extent, this should not be the standard we should strive towards.
Yes.
Don't strive toward the standard of fixing in advance, fixing before we fully mapped out the terrain. I do like that she pointed out that, for adolescents, children generally, but for adolescents, that some things are just phases. And there are moments in life where kids just have to go through a phase. And a phase is not some discrete category where we know, oh, this is going to be a 2-month phase. This is going to be a 3-month phase. This is going to be a year. We don't know how long somebody's going to be going through something. And so I can certainly understand, again, that desire to lower your anxiety as a parent, as a teacher, in some cases, perhaps as a therapist, trying to fix and change what you see as being painful, just fundamentally, just emotionally painful. But that pain may also be the exact route somebody needs to take to evolve into who they're already becoming. And I know that kind of steps into almost an existential domain to some degree. But, I once heard a speaker once say, there's too much pain to duck. There's just too much pain to avoid in life. It is baked into the cake of our experience. She had mentioned that she thought that part of, at least her perspective, was part of childhood. The purpose of childhood, perhaps, is to go through these challenges and go through the suffering. I don't know if I would have said the word purpose. I don't know if it's the purpose of childhood to make mistakes and to trip up, but it is baked into the equation, and it is going to naturally be part of life. And if you don't run up against it young, the chances that you're going to run up against it later, as you said, Jaco, de-skilled and not sure how to handle this new novel experience because somebody was handling it for you. I mean, we have rules around, even in caretaking facilities. If there's something someone can do for themselves, don't take it away from them. The odds that you're going to take away their ability to do that over time go up. If you're going to help somebody maintain their faculties or learn a new ability, you have to give them the chance. You have to give them the chance to fail at it. And then on the other side of it, if there's someone who can pick them up and show them where they messed up or show them where things fell short so they can do it the next time and approach it without this overwhelming anxiety, all the better. Great.
Yeah. So at some point she speaks about nature loving small errors. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
It normalizes the existence of mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And this drive towards perfectionism is part of the problem. To be the perfect parent and to have this idea of being the perfect parent, and being the perfect parent means that your child must never suffer. There's a problem in trying to be the perfect parent. You just need to be good enough, because life has to include some measure of failure so that you can. So just this day at the discussion with someone where I said, necessity is the mother of all invention, but the experience of necessity is frustration. So frustration is the mother of all invention, essentially. And if we want our households to be the training grounds for our children to be skilled, we need to permit the existence of frustration so that they can be gradually skilled up and be prepared for adulthood. And this word anti-fragility came up. And so many systems, even in our biological systems, are anti-fragile. You need to use them for them to be improved, right? Our bone structure, we need our bone structure to be stressed.
Yes.
Muscle structure, we need it to be stressed. Our immunity, you need to be exposed to germs and whatnot to build your immunity. Your brain, we all know the process of pruning, for instance. If you don't use certain faculties in your brain, you will lose it. If you don't use it, you lose it.
You have to be stress tested at the end of the day. Certain things have to be stress tested to see if they can either respond adequately, if they're going to fail under pressure, or if they're going to grow. If they're going to, even in things like in working out and building muscle, you have to break down the muscle in order for it to grow. You have to.
And with that process, there is also rest. There's also massage. There's also recuperation. And that is also what the family is there for. The family is not supposed to be like army training grounds. That's not the point, right? She's not making that point. But it's got to be the combination. And Christine, you and I have had our sessions and discussions on the CTA podcast, where we spoke about the combination of the maternal and the paternal factors or functions, right?
Yes.
Too much maternality is de-skilling. Too much paternality is also discouraging, but it's got to be the combination of the two.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that, and she pointed this out, I think it was in this chapter, something along these lines, but the whole idea that everybody gets a first place prize, right? There's no such thing. She didn't say it exactly that way, but I think she was speaking about just merit earned, recognition, so to speak. So this idea that everybody gets first place just because they tried. If we talk about weakening children's ability to face adversity or to face human failings, their own failures, because they're all going to fail, right? We all fail. We're going to fail. They're going to fail. And if they didn't study, or even if they did study and they got an F on the test, they don't get the first place prize. They don't get gee, you tried really hard, so we're going to give you an A because you tried. But William over here or Susie over here got 100% on that test, And
Susie
she
again.
also gets it's always Susie.
Always Susie. Always
She's
Susie.
Every time. And there she is again with her A. And so that completely, just diminishes everything that she did to earn that. And I think that's another big issue. And I think it's something that Abigail does address in the book in her own way, that kids are going to recover from getting that F or failing. But to grant it to everybody and have it be an equitable type of experience or situation leads to more problems and a lack of maturation in the future for these kids. They have to learn how to fail. Even if you try hard at something and you still fail at it, that's a big bummer, right? It's very disappointing, but that comes, it's par for the course. It comes along with this, it's baked into life, as well, as you said earlier, Michael, that whole concept. It's going to be there. And I think that's a really big issue why you have these 25-year-old kids today that can't launch. They cannot launch from their parents' homes. They cannot launch from, college to getting a job, or from a trade school to getting a job, or, even working right after high school if college is not in the cards or school is not in the cards. But this idea that there's this big failure to launch, and I think that has a lot to do with it. They have a hard time tolerating discomfort and tolerating disappointment and tolerating not getting that job and tolerating, not coming in first place or getting a pat on the back because everybody got a pat on the back. So I think that failure to launch issue is where we have a problem it's a generational issue that's gonna continue to pass along. It will change the fabric of our culture even more so than it already has. That's what actually worries me if I think about it in that fashion.
Is this training kids not to have a toleration of affect, essentially, of
absolutely.
negative affect in particular?
Absolutely.
Do we feel there's a way to walk this back? I think about early work in clinical settings where I was doing exposure therapy with people. It was an incremental process of setting up a hierarchy and a scale of perceived negative events, things that would make them anxious, and slowly working them towards those things. Quite often they would find that if we did post-event processing, we had them, guess in advance on a scale of 1 to 10 how anxious they expected. More often than not, and this is anecdotal, I would find that clients overestimated how scary and intolerable something is.
Of course.
And
Absolutely.
it makes perfect sense. I think I do too. And it makes perfect sense. We're preparing for the battle. We're preparing for the thing, whatever that thing means to us, as being a moment where we have to kind of fight and contend. And then if you can overcome that, if you can go through that in a way that feels reasonably successful, well, maybe you can handle the next thing, the next monster on the horizon. I think she points to that really well. I do find it interesting that when she's doing, not to harp on the cross-cultural comparisons, talking about children in Japan, traversing. I was just imagining kids traversing town
with the squeaky flip-flops.
With the squeaky flip-flops and the flag, and I was just trying to imagine this, and I was like, context is important too. I'm not sure what Japan does to make that a possibility, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that in every place in the world. But I think it does speak to some degree to make her point, to make that giant, loud, triumphant, that loud point that there's so much that kids can do under the right conditions with the right guidance. And that maybe parents have just been pushed into this position of fretting all the time. And as you said earlier, Jaco, this comparison, I think about kids comparing with each other on social media. But when she pointed out the WhatsApp group where parents were asking about their children's assignments and checking with one another, essentially doing the due diligence for their kids. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I was handed a syllabus, every semester growing up. And if I needed to find something, the teacher told me to refer to the syllabus. They said, look back, everything you need to know, follow the weeks. That's a skill there. Follow the weeks. What week are we on? What's the date? What are we working on? And I was like, are kids not being told to, go back to the syllabus again? Are they not being taught the referential skills that they need to navigate the world? So saying go back to the syllabus isn't just one thing. It's saying do your research, look it up.
Yes, and try to problem solve first before you
try to problem solve first.
Yes.
And I had my very first supervisor out of college, before I was even a therapist. I had changed careers. that was her biggest pet peeve, is
Mhm.
if you come to me with a question and you haven't researched and looked for the answer or the solution first, then I don't
Mhm.
want to hear about it. Go do that, then come to me if you need some help. That was something that was a very big deal to her. And anybody who was not able to do that did not last in that position.
Mhm.
And that is something that that these kids are gonna face in the real world, not just at work, but in general. They have to learn how to try to problem solve first. Refer back to your syllabus. Refer
Mhm.
back to what the assignment was, the way it's written. I had graduate students when I was teaching who would be too lazy to go back and refer to the syllabus, where I had all the appendices for every single project and every single paper that was due that quarter, and the instructions on what I wanted laid out, outlined, boom, boom, boom. And it would drive me crazy. And these are graduate students, right? Who are adults already.
Yeah.
So 100%.
Extended daycare.
Yes, extended daycare. Refer back to your syllabus. I love it. That's what that's
Give
gonna
it
be
a
our little phrase here.
give it a shot. At the end of the
Yeah,
day, give it a shot.
absolutely.
Give it a go. See how it goes. And if you need the support, it's great if the support is there. It
Yeah.
is.
You see, because the experience of failure is not all there is. There is also the experience of recovery. There's also
Yes.
the experience of repair. That's part of life.
Yes.
So, and maybe this is more fitting from, more applicable to our previous discussions, but parental expectations are unconsciously conveyed and also absorbed or internalized by children. And
Yes.
if parental expectations are, my child is too fragile, at some level, the child will believe that to be true.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Whereas
Absolutely.
if parental expectation is, yeah, my child will find this difficult, but sure, he or she will be grand. They will
Well,
also work with this. They will also wrestle with this, and they'll figure it out. They'll figure it out. That confidence is also conveyed unconsciously
yes.
Mhm.
and
And
absorbed by the child.
yeah, and she even mentions giving over praise for simple tasks is also not valuable,
Of course not.
because
Silly.
it's very silly, right? So
You, you,
getting a
you
gold
don't
star,
applaud a fish when it swims.
there you go.
Right.
Perfectly said. Yes.
Yeah. So there are certain things that are just things that ought to be done.
Yes.
Yes. And they need to fit
Without
in.
getting a reward and without getting overly
Hmm.
praised for it, because it's just an expectation, or it's a responsibility of daily life.
Yeah.
It's a part of
It's an
life.
expectation. Yes.
Mhm.
It's an expectation. So I think she points that out very well as in the book too, especially these last
So
couple chapters.
Mhm.
yeah, so in chapter 12,
Yes,
she
spoons out.
starts she spoons out. She starts off by just highlighting again to your point, Michael, she's addressing a certain cultural moment, and she's targeting a certain socioeconomic demographic when she says our kids spend less time with friends. They've less privacy than ever. They spend less time with grandparents and extended family members. They're on display all the time. They're being monitored all the time. They get less sleep than in any other previous generation. Psychological and psychiatric crises are ever present, and they self-define or they self-characterize using clinical diagnosis.
Yes.
It's dismal. It's dismal. This is Big Brother stuff. It's dismal.
In particular, when she was talking about, I think it was maybe a Facebook post where the parent was
Yeah.
applauding.
My
And I don't
dyslexic.
look, managing dyslexia, I'm sure it comes with I know it comes with its challenges, but to highlight their child based on their challenge versus just focusing on the fact that their kid is doing well and that it's a person, not a diagnosis.
Mm,
I can't help but see a diagnosis being held up as an avatar and a representative of
Mm.
children now, or just people generally maybe. that we've started to, and we kind of started off with this conversations over identification with these labels, these diagnoses, where sometimes what we're talking about is not something we have to draw up a category for. I'm thinking clinically. Sometimes people they come into a clinical setting and they're talking about just parts of life that just are just part of their experience, kind of par for the course even for people, and how easily they're being slapped, having a label thrown on it right away as a way to almost explain away something that might be commonplace. I hope that's clear and not too nebulous and vague.
No.
But there are certain things we can cluster into diagnostic categories just because.
Yes.
And then there are certain things that if you pull them apart, that constellation falls apart with it as you start to understand kind of the nuance and the texture behind what it is you're trying to capture. I don't know. I get the sense that we've tried to like almost bottle experiences into these diagnostic categories to the point of detriment.
Mm-hmm.
Having something we can look at as opposed to something we can explore. Do you guys have that sense as well?
I think it's the same with any kind of label. If it's mental health, or if it's, oh, this is my son, the jock, or this is my daughter, the dancer, right? A label that in some way, I think boxes that child in, whether it's a mental health label or it's a label that, like I said, this is my daughter, the dancer. She's my pretty ballerina. I mean, I've heard these kinds of statements and phrases come out of parents' mouths before, where they've already identified their kid and made the decision that that's what their kid is and that's what they are going to be. And there's no wiggle room there. That's the label. It's
the modern version of the Breakfast Club.
It's the modern version of the Breakfast Club. That's a really good point. And the whole point of that film was to say we're not, any of these things, we're all of these things, right? We have a little bit of this in us. We have a little bit of the creative in us. We have a little bit of the dancer in us, a little bit of the jock in us.
Right.
The whole point of that film was to say, you can't put us in these boxes. So I think that's something that, not just with mental health, but it happens with just these other extracurricular kinds of activities, especially if the parents are deriving some sort of pleasure from seeing their kid, be a superstar on the football team, right? Then that becomes more about the parent sometimes than it is about whether or not the kid even wants to be there. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah. And also just to the point of diagnostic language, I have found that some of the patients that I've had use more clinical language than I do.
Oh, interesting.
How do you feel with that? Because I often run into the same thing. I become kind of tight around it. Well, I'm trying to understand exactly when somebody comes to me with their own language that sounds similar to maybe language I might use. I'm instantly like, I get curious.
Idiolect.
Of
course.
Right.
Yeah, and sometimes you need to tell them, when you use the word anxiety, when I use the word anxiety, we may be using the same word, but I can guarantee you different meanings. So how about you just maybe we think about that word, and maybe you can tell me a bit more about that. But it's almost like some of them expect a type of clinical performance from you as a therapist, especially in the beginning. They want you to back out, to fire away with the lingo. And then they run into someone who just uses normal language. And I think it is jarring it's jarring to them in the beginning.
Yeah.
But it's amazing. It's amazing what it actually achieves, because we finally give our clients, our patients, the opportunity to feel and to use original language, or however they want to express it. Yes, however they want to describe it or express it, to use that to convey and to make sense of their experience, as opposed to resorting to pre-packaged clinical language.
And it's so easy to get seduced by that as a clinician, just as a human being. And so I imagine for these parents, a kid coming home from therapy with a whole set of diagnoses and new ways that they're explaining their experience, not in a descriptive and fleshed out sense, but in that package sense that you're describing. and parents wanting to maybe do the right thing here by their kids, getting pulled down this path of, I don't know what to do, kind of feeling decoupled from their power or their position as a parent.
We will be different. We will stand out as different when we're real people as therapists, as
That's
opposed
right.
to this recent trend. We will be different. Parents will be bringing their children with certain expectations, the expectations that have been shaped by popular culture as well as therapeutic ideologues, and they will run into a different kind of therapist when they run into people like us. And so be it. So be it.
So be it.
I was that way as a professor as well. I mean, I used common language to describe or to talk about very complex ideas. I was always known for doing that because they would come in to the class without a huge, their first couple, first time coming to graduate school for the program and, whatever. And they themselves have these pop culture, trendy psychological concept words that they bring in that A, either mean nothing, or B, means something completely different than the context in which they're using it, or C, it's not necessary to use it at all because there are different ways to discuss these issues. So yeah, I think you see that everywhere. It's sort of a trendy kind of hip. I mean, it started off with when we started having people like Dr. Phil have his own talk show, who's a pop culture psychologist and extremely popular here, right? And he sits and has guests and he writes books about, how to be a parent and how to be in a relationship and all of this kind of stuff. So people read these books and think they're experts in psychology and they're experts in understanding their own pathology, which may or may not be the case.
Might not be the case. And I've recently, this is kind of an aside, have seen almost a walking back from that, thinking of some Dr. Phil episodes that have popped up on YouTube or something like that, where there's a recognition and almost a walking back saying, okay, what is going on here? What, did the genie get out of the bottle here?
Yes. Yes.
Did we commodify mental health into something that somebody can not just pull off the shelf, but just pull right off their computer at home and say, I identify with this. This is who I am.
That's
and
right.
I think we've run into that.
That's right. And they're doing it with their kids. So to bring it back to her book, they're doing it with their children as well, right? So that's how parents are entering into, therapy situation with their kids using that kind of language. And they just, Googled it on the internet or listened to a couple of podcasts and have decided now they know exactly what's going on. The problem.
She makes a point here, and it's almost like a repetitive point. She made it earlier on in the book as well, where she says preventative mental health intervention, by definition, unnecessary, stultifies maturation, trapping young people in a punishing loop of rumination on feelings, treatment dependency, powerful risk aversion. It inhibits the normal process of adolescing out of youth and casting off the angst of adolescence. We interpret young people's stultification as mental illness, but very often it isn't. It's the malaise that sets in when they realize they're the age their grandfather was when he married their grandmother and they're too scared to ask a girl out. And I've had it. I don't know if any of you have had it, where someone comes, makes an appointment and says, no, I just want to check. I just want to check. I want to come for therapy. Okay, so what are we working on? No, I just want to check. You'll be drowsy.
Yes.
You'll be drowsy from session number 1.
That's right.
Because there's nothing to work on. The person person provides you with what they imagine you want to hear.
Yes.
You'll be drowsy from session 1 to session how many ever you're willing to endure such torture.
Yes.
And it opens up a risk, doesn't it, of us looking for something to start to kind of work on, which is not a position I want to find myself in as a clinician. I don't want to be drumming up issues that aren't they're not causing functional impairment. They're not wide sweeping in terms of different areas of life being mismanaged or being harmed.
No.
I don't want to start looking for that in clients. And I don't think most therapists who are really focused on what their craft and their art is do want to drum that up. But sometimes somebody
Yeah.
does come in, as you said, and it's just like, I think I'm supposed to be here like I'm at my dentist for a teeth cleaning. And
Mm.
I think there was a point in my career where I thought, man, it'd be really nice if people could go to therapy ahead of time before there was a problem. But I think after years, I mean, look at where I am right now, years down the line, learning the relevant literature and also seeing what that can look like experientially, I don't hold that position anymore. I think
Mm.
it's kind of along the lines of, it's not really, you don't need a therapist to the degree that you think you need a therapist. I don't know that that's the right way to think about going to therapy. It's you need a therapist to the degree that there's something that is really afflicting you and is confronting you, that is making life more challenging in one or more ways. And I'll leave it kind of vague in that sense, in that there needs to be
Mm.
something that we're exploring together, as
Yeah.
opposed to, yeah, please.
And if there isn't anything, well, don't go to a therapist. Go to a philosopher. Go on retreats. Meditate. Do that.
Read.
Don't go for therapy.
Yes.
Read
And
philosophy,
I
read
think she,
existential philosophy, or read Buddhist philosophy, whatever the case may be, but don't go to a therapist.
and I think she makes, and I mean, kind of as we're drawing to a close of the book here and, our conversation on the book, I think that's her whole point at the end of the day, is
Mm.
that the therapists, these experts are not necessarily the experts on your child. They're not necessarily the experts on you. They're not necessarily the experts you should be listening to, because they may have no purpose. You may need something else for your kid. You may need to spend more time with your kid at the park rather than in front of their computer or on their cell phone, texting and doing whatever different kinds of things. At the end of the day, that's her entire point, right? Is that we're
Mm.
overutilizing therapists looking for something to fix, for something to be wrong, and for us to be able to label it and then go from there. And I think that's where the big errors are that she's pointing out about bad therapy.
Yeah.
One of the things she ended on, which I really particularly appreciated, was the change in community for, again, just broad strokes, for a lot of people, the absence of close kinship networks. And in some
Yeah.
ways, I wonder if we've fallen into almost this wise man, this guru role, this role of spiritual head almost in some ways for some people, trying to make up for an absence of something that they naturally would have in a closer network within their lives. I do wonder if at times we're falling into this position that historically was held by other members of a community, let's say, or family members.
Yeah. Priests.
Or
Yes.
priests. Mm-hmm.
So she ends by saying this. She says, remove the spoons, the technology, the hovering, the monitoring, the constant doubt, the diagnosing of ordinary behaviors as pathological, the psychiatric medications you aren't convinced your child needs, the expert evaluations. Banish from their lives everyone with a tendency to treat your children as disordered. You don't need them. You never needed them, and your kids are almost certainly better off without them. And then she says, having kids is the best, most worthy thing you could possibly do. Raise them well. You're the only one who can.
Mhm.
Bottom line,
Yes.
use your intuitions. I know we've been through peak woke, where everything about the West, sorry, I will lower my hand, where everything about the West
Perfect time to
has been
testify.
has been demonized, as bad. This has disorientated us because parents are no longer trusting their culture, no longer trusting their intuitions. She says, you are the parents, you know what works, what doesn't work. Raise your children from your own experience, your own wisdom.
Yes.
You're the only one who would do that the best.
Yes.
So,
Any other final thoughts that
hmm.
any of us have or that you have about the book or about just in general, I mean, we kind of strayed off into therapy in general in this conversation, but I think it was important to talk about. Anything else that's sort of standing out that we want to end on?
I enjoyed the ride. I'll just say that. I enjoyed
Okay.
getting, I really wanted to hear what an outsider. This is a case study of one. What an
Yes.
outsider thought about our field after investigating as many nuanced elements of the work as she could. In my mind, what we were reading about was a therapized culture versus therapy proper. And I think it's easy to forget that there are day in, day outer therapists who are doing their utmost with these sensibilities in mind to do right by their clients. But this adoption and this bleeding over effect that we've seen as therapy has become a thing. It's become an object that almost gets wielded to some degree, has led to some unfortunate circumstances for some people. And I think has actually in some ways made our job both more pertinent, but also more difficult and complex in its own right. That tightness I was describing before, I think is exactly what I mean is, okay, what are we here to do? What are we focusing on right now? What is this moment asking of me? And I do think there are therapists who are and I've met them. I know them. I'm sitting with two right now who take that into mind when they sit down with the person, they're sitting down with the person, and that they're exploring that person's experience and not some cultural zeitgeist kind of conversation, but that person. I think that sensibility is still out there.
It is. It is.
I'm looking forward to discussing the next book with you.
Sounds good. We shall do that.
Looking forward to it.
Right.
Yes. All right, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. It was great.